The crystal glasses clinked rhythmically inside the luxurious dining hall of the Miller estate in Scottsdale, while my entire focus remained fixed on the dark corner of the room. I am Bethany, a 32-year-old emergency dispatcher who has spent years managing chaos, but nothing prepared me for the sight of my 10-year-old daughter Katelyn trembling in the shadows. A crude cardboard sign with the words "Family Disgrace" hung from a jagged hemp rope around her small neck, while the rest of the family enjoyed a lavish Christmas feast just a few feet away. My father-in-law Arthur suddenly slammed his fist onto the mahogany table and roared that I was a pathetic mother who failed to discipline a lying child in front of all our prestigious guests. He pointed a trembling finger toward the door and barked a final ultimatum that would change our lives forever. Like mother, like daughter. Make her apologize right now, or I will kick both of you out of this house into the freezing night. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me as I stood up without a word to untie the rough rope from Katelyn's neck. I looked directly into Arthur's eyes with a silence that screamed louder than his rage, because I knew this was the final moment we would ever breathe the same air. I gripped my daughter's hand firmly and began walking toward the exit while realizing that the truth Katelyn told about being bullied was worth more than any inheritance this toxic family could ever offer. The Miller family thought they could starve my daughter into submission, but they had no idea I was already holding the keys to their ultimate downfall. Subscribe now to witness how I used their own greed to dismantle their empire and ensure they lost every cent they tried to steal from us. 6 hours before the tragedy unfolded at the dining table, the high-pitched emergency alarm at the Scottsdale Fire Dispatch Center forced me to abandon my quiet Christmas preparations. A massive wildfire had ignited in the brush near the hillside communities because of the dry seasonal winds requiring every available coordinator to manage the incoming chaos. Since I am a senior dispatcher, my supervisor insisted that my presence was mandatory to handle the complex communication between the ground crews and the aerial tankers. I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest because I had originally planned to spend the entire evening decorating cookies with Katelyn. The pressure of the unfolding natural disaster left me with no choice but to find a safe place for my daughter while I navigated the emergency radio frequencies. Just as I was about to call a neighbor for help, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from my father-in-law Arthur, who sounded uncharacteristically warm and supportive. He insisted that Katelyn should spend the evening at his luxury estate since he wanted her to be part of the family's traditional celebration despite our recent distance. Arthur promised me that he would look after her personally and ensure she felt included in every part of the festivities, while I focused on saving the hillside homes from the encroaching flames. I felt a brief sense of relief while dropping Katelyn off at the grand entrance of the Miller mansion before racing back to the dispatch center. I handed her a small, neatly wrapped box containing a handmade wooden ornament she had spent weeks carving for her grandfather as a sign of respect. Please make sure Arthur gets this during the gift exchange because she worked very hard on it. I told my brother-in-law Bradley, who met us at the door with a dismissive nod. Bradley had always been cold toward us since the passing of my husband Julian, but I assumed the holiday spirit might soften his usual resentment toward my presence. The shift was grueling as I spent hours staring at glowing monitors and barking coordinates to firefighters who were battling 40-foot flames in the canyons. Every time I tried to check my personal phone for an update on Katelyn, the lines would erupt with new emergency reports that demanded my immediate attention. I managed to send a quick text to my sister-in-law Stephanie, asking for a photo of Katelyn enjoying the party, but the message remained unread for over 3 hours. I began to feel a strange hollow sensation in my stomach that had nothing to do with the lack of dinner and everything to do with the heavy silence from the Miller estate. Deep down, I knew that Stephanie was likely busy hosting her prestigious guests, yet the complete lack of communication felt intentional and malicious. My late husband Julian used to warn me that his family only showed kindness when they wanted something in return, but I had hoped they would at least respect his memory by being decent to his only child. During a brief bathroom break, I finally saw that Katelyn's phone had been completely disconnected from the network, which made my blood run cold in the middle of the air-conditioned office. My mother's intuition screamed at me that something was terribly wrong, especially when I thought about Mason, the teenage son of Bradley and Stephanie. Mason had always been a troubled boy who displayed a cruel streak toward Katelyn because he was jealous of the inheritance Julian had secured for her future. I could almost hear Arthur's booming voice in the back of my mind, probably scolding my daughter for some minor infraction, while the rest of the family watched in silence. I approached my supervisor with trembling hands and requested to hand over my station to the night relief crew 2 hours earlier than scheduled. I cannot stay here any longer because my daughter is not answering her phone, and I need to get to her right now, I said, while grabbing my coat and running toward the parking lot. The drive back to the Miller estate felt like an eternity as I ignored the speed limits and focused entirely on the dark road ahead. Exactly 11 o'clock at night, my car's headlights sliced through the deserted road leading to the Miller estate entrance in a terrifying silence. I stepped into the house and found Stephanie casually sipping red wine, while my daughter was forced to stand in a punishment corner of the empty dining room. Bradley and Mason sat comfortably on the sofa laughing together, while shamelessly finishing every piece of the Christmas cake that I had specially prepared for Katelyn earlier that afternoon. My anger erupted when I noticed the dark red welts on Katelyn's neck, caused by the rough rope of the cardboard sign Arthur had forced her to wear as a mark of shame. Arthur stepped forward with a cold glare and declared that Mason was simply disciplining his younger sister for being a malicious liar. He claimed that Katelyn's accusation about Mason stealing Julian's memorial items was a dishonest act that could not be tolerated within a prestigious family. I did not waste my breath arguing with people who derived pleasure from torturing a child, but instead I quietly took out my phone to photograph the scene. I captured every detail of the cardboard sign and the visible scratches on my daughter's skin to serve as legal evidence for the future we were about to build. Bradley looked up from his plate with a mocking smirk while telling me that I should be grateful they were even willing to correct my daughter's poor behavior. Mason is the future of this family, and he has every right to put a liar in her place, he said with a tone of arrogance that made my skin crawl. I ignored his taunts while kneeling down to carefully untie the jagged rope from Katelyn's small neck so that I could take her away from this toxic environment immediately. Katelyn gripped my hand with trembling fingers and looked up at me with tears streaming down her face because she was exhausted from the hours of isolation. Mommy, I am not lying. Mason really took Daddy's watch from the drawer and hid it in his room, she whispered with a voice that broke my heart into a million pieces. I kissed her forehead and told her that I believed her completely while the rest of the Miller family watched us with expressions of pure disdain. Arthur stood by the fireplace and warned me that if I walked out of the door now, I would never receive a single penny of support from him ever again. I looked back at Arthur with a smile of cold defiance while realizing that his money was the only thing he had left to threaten me with in this world. I know the truth now, Katelyn, so let's go because this house is no longer a place for us or for anyone with a soul, I said firmly while guiding her toward the exit. We walked past Stephanie, who didn't even have the decency to look up from her glass of wine, as her own niece suffered just a few feet away. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind us for the last time as we left the Miller mansion and its cruelty in the rearview mirror of my car. I drove away into the cold desert night while feeling a strange sense of liberation because the mask of family unity had finally been shattered beyond repair. Katelyn eventually fell asleep in the back seat, but I stayed awake planning my next move with the photographs I had just taken on my phone. The battle for justice was only beginning, and I was prepared to use every resource available to make sure Arthur and his son paid for what they did. My daughter's safety was my only priority now, and I knew that Julian would have wanted me to fight back with everything I had left. As the car rolled along the deserted avenue toward our small house, Katelyn began to sob uncontrollably while relaying the full extent of what had happened during my absence. My daughter described how Mason would frequently strike her in private areas and along her ribs to ensure that no visible bruises would remain for outsiders or teachers to see. The most horrifying truth was that both Arthur and Bradley were fully aware of the systematic abuse Mason inflicted on Katelyn, yet they constantly threatened to throw us out onto the street if she ever dared to speak a word about it. They used our financial vulnerability as a cage to keep my daughter silent, while their golden boy practiced his cruelty without facing any consequences from the adults in the house. We finally reached the safety of our home, where I immediately guided Katelyn to the bathroom to check for any internal injuries that required medical attention. Once I was certain she was physically stable, I went down to the basement to locate the heavy metal box containing the estate documents that Julian had secretly kept before his passing. My hands were shaking as I brushed off the dust and turned the key to reveal a collection of files that my husband had never mentioned during our years together. I stood frozen in disbelief as I found the original title deed for the Scottsdale mansion where Arthur was currently living, realizing that the property was legally registered under my name and Julian's name. It became clear through the bank statements that Julian had known about his father's secret bankruptcy and massive debts years ago, so he used his own private savings to buy the house back from the bank. He had intentionally kept this information hidden from Arthur and Bradley to ensure that Katelyn and I would always have a permanent place to live, regardless of the family's financial failures. Julian had essentially become the landlord of his own father to protect us from the very greed that was now trying to destroy our lives from within. I realized that the threats Arthur made about kicking us out were completely empty because he was actually the one living on our property without paying a single dime in rent. Katelyn stood at the top of the basement stairs holding a small velvet pouch that she had managed to hide in her jacket before we fled the mansion. Daddy told me I had to protect this box if he was no longer here, but Mason found the watch before I could hide it, she said while handing me the key Julian had given her as a secret game. I pulled her into a tight hug and felt a surge of cold determination as I realized that my husband had provided us with everything we needed to fight back against his toxic family. Do not worry, Katelyn, your father has given us a sword to protect ourselves, and I promise you that we will use it to take back everything they stole, I said, with a voice that was now devoid of any fear or hesitation. I spent the rest of the night scanning every document into my laptop while organizing the evidence of Arthur's financial collapse and his illegal occupation of the estate. The realization that my husband had spent his final months planning for our protection gave me the strength to stop crying and start acting like the dispatcher I was trained to be. I knew that the Miller family would expect me to be broken and defeated by their cruelty, but they had no idea that I was now holding the legal power to dismantle their entire world. Tomorrow morning would bring a new reality for Arthur and Bradley, as I prepared to reveal the truth that Julian had buried deep within this metal box. My daughter finally fell into a peaceful sleep, while I sat in the glow of the computer screen, ready to turn the legacy of a dead man into a weapon for justice. At 8 o'clock the following morning, my phone vibrated incessantly with a barrage of malicious notifications from various Scottsdale community groups. I discovered that Stephanie had posted a series of edited photos accompanied by fabricated claims that I was an unfit mother who abandoned her child to pursue a career. She even went as far as suggesting that Katelyn suffered from severe psychological instability and that the Miller family was merely trying to protect the girl from my negligence. The comment sections were filled with judgment from neighbors who knew nothing of the bruises hidden under my daughter's clothes or the cardboard sign that had been tied around her neck. Just as I felt the weight of these lies pressing down on me, my best friend Giselle appeared at my front door, holding a thick folder of credit reports. She had spent the entire night utilizing her connections in the financial sector to investigate the Miller family's recent activities on my behalf. Giselle pointed out that Bradley had surreptitiously used my personal information to secure multiple loans totaling $15,000 to fund Mason's extravagant lifestyle. They had not only abused my daughter, but were also systematically draining my credit score to pay for the indulgences of the very boy who had tormented her. I realized at that moment that I could no longer rely solely on Giselle's sympathy or my own grief to survive this onslaught. I needed a ruthless legal strategy to confront the Miller family before they managed to turn the entire city against me and my daughter. I immediately contacted Marcus, a lawyer specializing in real estate and financial fraud, who was notorious for never showing mercy in high-stakes family disputes. Marcus had a reputation for dismantling corrupt dynasties, and I knew his cold, calculated approach was exactly what I needed to reclaim my life. Giselle looked at the hateful posts on her own phone and gripped my shoulder with a mixture of frustration and genuine concern for our safety. "How long do you plan to stay silent, Bethany? They are clearly trying to destroy your reputation and take everything you have left," she exclaimed while pacing across my living room floor. I looked at the legal documents Julian had left in the basement and felt a strange sense of calm wash over my entire body. "No, Giselle. I am not staying silent. I am simply waiting for them to sink deeper into the trap they have dug for themselves," I replied with a coldness that surprised even my closest friend. I sat down with Marcus later that afternoon to present the evidence of the property deed and the photographs of Katelyn's injuries. He reviewed the documents with a clinical focus and noted that Bradley's identity theft was a felony that would carry significant prison time if prosecuted correctly. Marcus explained that Stephanie's social media campaign actually provided us with further evidence of calculated harassment and emotional distress. We began drafting a series of legal filings that would hit the Miller family from 3 different directions simultaneously to ensure they had no room to maneuver. I watched the sunset over the Scottsdale horizon while realizing that the woman who walked into that mansion on Christmas Eve was gone forever. The Miller family thought they were dealing with a grieving widow, but they were actually facing a mother who had nothing left to lose, and a legal team ready for war. I told Marcus to prepare the final notices for delivery because I wanted the family to receive their first taste of reality before the new year began. My heart was no longer racing with fear because I finally had the evidence and the allies necessary to burn their house of lies to the ground. By the afternoon of December 27th, I was present at the office of my lawyer Marcus to face the brutal numbers that defined the Miller family's corruption. Marcus sat across from me with a grim expression while presenting digital records showing that Arthur had secretly drained Katelyn's education fund. My father-in-law had systematically withdrawn $50,000 from her college savings to keep his failing real estate company afloat during the recent market downturn. It was a cold realization that the man who claimed to value family heritage was willing to steal his own granddaughter's future to hide his business incompetence. We further uncovered concrete evidence that Arthur had committed property tax fraud for the past 3 years by declaring my primary residence as his own main home. He had been exploiting legal loopholes to avoid thousands of dollars in taxes, while the IRS remained completely unaware of his dual residency scheme. Marcus explained that this was a serious federal offense that would attract immediate attention from investigators once we filed the formal report. While we were digging through these financial layers, Marcus received an alert from an online auction site where Julian's memorial, Patek Philippe watch, had just been listed. I felt a surge of nausea when I saw the photos Bradley had uploaded to the auction page to sell my late husband's most precious possession for quick cash. Bradley was clearly desperate to cover his own personal gambling debts and thought he could liquidate our family heirlooms before I had a chance to claim them. I spent the next hour recording a frantic phone call from Arthur as he screamed threats into my voicemail about using his political influence in Scottsdale to put me in prison. He accused me of slander and warned that my career as a dispatcher would be over if I didn't drop my demands and return the property deeds immediately. Arthur's voice was filled with a desperate rage because he knew his house of cards was starting to collapse under the weight of our legal investigation. Marcus sat quietly while listening to the recording and noted that these threats only added more weight to our case for harassment and witness intimidation. My lawyer advised me to file simultaneous complaints with both the Internal Revenue Service and Child Protective Services to ensure Arthur had no way to escape the consequences. They have broken federal laws, Bethany, and this is no longer just a private family matter, but a series of serious felonies, Marcus said while organizing the final evidence folders. I looked at the mountain of paperwork on his desk and felt a strange sense of peace because the truth was finally documented in black and white. I wanted the Miller family to experience the full weight of the law at the exact moment they thought they were most secure. Please prepare all the official documents, Marcus, because I want them to receive the notices on the very last day of the year. I replied with a steady voice that left no room for negotiation. I was no longer interested in apologies or family reunions because I knew that people like Arthur and Bradley only understood the language of power and loss. We spent the rest of the evening cross-referencing every bank statement and tax filing to make sure our case was completely airtight against any counterclaims. Marcus assured me that the combination of financial theft and child abuse would be enough to dismantle the Miller dynasty once and for all. I walked out of the law firm into the cool evening air while feeling like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders for the first time since Julian's funeral. The countdown to the new year had begun, and I was ready to watch the walls of the Miller mansion crumble under the truth. Early in the morning of December 30th, several express delivery letters with certified signatures were officially delivered to the gates of the Miller mansion. Scottsdale police officers, alongside agents from the Child Protective Services, unexpectedly arrived at Arthur's home to execute a search warrant and investigate reports of child abuse. Stephanie panicked when she discovered that her social media accounts had been locked while she faced a massive civil lawsuit for defamation and invasion of privacy. Bradley was arrested right at his office for the crimes of forging signatures and illegal misappropriation of assets after the police found Julian's watch hidden inside his vehicle. The entire file regarding Arthur's tax fraud was transferred directly to the Internal Revenue Service, which forced him to face an immediate freeze on all his assets for the investigation. Neighbors in Scottsdale began to whisper and turn away as they witnessed the humiliating scenes unfolding in front of the mansion that was once famous for its prestige. Arthur stood on the front porch with a face twisted in rage while the authorities removed boxes of financial records from his private study. He watched as his reputation crumbled in a matter of hours, while the community he once dominated now looked at him with nothing but disgust and suspicion. I arrived at the scene with Marcus to ensure that the eviction notice was served personally while the police were still conducting their search of the premises. Arthur lunged toward me with a desperate look in his eyes because he realized that his world of luxury was finally coming to a violent end. "You are absolutely insane, Bethany, because you are destroying this entire family with your lies and your bitterness," he screamed while the officers held him back from getting closer to me. I looked at the man who had allowed his grandson to torment Katelyn and felt nothing but a cold sense of justice finally being served. This family was already destroyed from the moment you heartlessly starved a 10-year-old child for your own amusement, Arthur. I replied with a calm voice that cut through his shouting. Stephanie tried to hide her face from the cameras while the Child Protective Services agents questioned her about the night they left Katelyn alone in the dining room. She had spent weeks building a false narrative about my life, but now she was the one whose character was being dismantled by the very public she tried to manipulate. Bradley sat in the back of a patrol car with his head down because he knew that the evidence of his theft was undeniable and would lead to years in prison. The Miller dynasty was falling apart piece by piece as the legal system finally caught up with their years of arrogance and financial deception. Marcus handed me the final confirmation that the freeze on Arthur's bank accounts had been successfully implemented across all major financial institutions. This meant that the Millers no longer had the resources to hire expensive crisis management teams or bribe their way out of the impending criminal charges. We stood on the sidewalk watching as the movers began to prepare for the eventual removal of the family's remaining personal belongings from my property. Katelyn remained safely at home with Giselle while I finished the work that Julian had started when he first bought this house back for our future. The sunset that evening marked the beginning of a very different life for all of us as the Millers prepared to spend their new year in legal turmoil. I felt no guilt for the chaos I had unleashed because I knew that every action was a direct consequence of their own cruelty toward a defenseless girl. We had successfully turned their own weapons against them, and now they would have to face the cold reality of a life without their stolen wealth or social status. The battle was far from over, but the most important victory had been won when the police escorted Bradley away in handcuffs for the world to see. The sunrise of the new year glowed brightly behind the Arizona mountain ranges, while marking the definitive end of a Miller empire built entirely on layers of deception. Arthur was forced to declare complete bankruptcy and watched helplessly as the bank officially foreclosed on the Scottsdale mansion to pay back years of unpaid taxes and massive fraud penalties. The prestigious life he had cultivated through theft and intimidation vanished in a single morning, while creditors began seizing every piece of luxury furniture left in the house. It was a deservedly quiet end for a man who believed his social status allowed him to be above the law and the basic rules of human decency. Bradley received a substantial prison sentence for his involvement in identity theft and financial fraud, while Mason was ordered into a specialized juvenile detention facility following his psychological evaluation. The state experts confirmed that Mason exhibited deeply ingrained violent behaviors and required intensive intervention that his family had ignored for far too long. Stephanie vanished from the social scene entirely after the defamation lawsuit stripped her of her remaining savings and left her reputation in permanent ruins. The once powerful family was now scattered across different legal proceedings, while the public they tried to manipulate quickly moved on to the next scandal. I successfully completed the sale of the Scottsdale estate that Julian had secretly protected for us and used every penny to establish a secure trust fund for Katelyn's future education. This fund was legally locked away to ensure that no one from the Miller lineage could ever touch her inheritance or threaten her financial stability again. Julian's foresight had not only saved us from homelessness, but also provided the means for his daughter to pursue her dreams without the shadow of debt hanging over her. I felt a profound sense of closure as I signed the final closing documents and handed over the keys to the new owners of that cold marble house. Katelyn and I decided to sell our old home as well, to seek a fresh start in the mountains of Colorado, where we could finally breathe without the suffocating influence of our past. We packed our remaining belongings into a small trailer and began the long drive north to cut all ties with the toxic Miller family, forever. I watched my daughter smile as she played with her toys in the back seat, while the city of Scottsdale slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror. The weight that had occupied my chest since Julian's funeral was finally gone because I knew we were heading toward a place where her safety was guaranteed. We arrived at our new cabin near a quiet forest where the air was crisp and the neighbors didn't know anything about the dramatic headlines we left behind in Arizona. Katelyn began her new school under her mother's maiden name to prevent any further harassment, and she quickly made friends who liked her for who she was. I found a job in the local emergency services department, where my skills as a dispatcher were appreciated without the constant threat of political interference from wealthy relatives. Our lives were finally quiet and predictable in the best way possible, while we focused on healing the emotional wounds that Arthur and his sons had inflicted. On our first evening in the new house, Katelyn sat by the fireplace and looked at a framed photo of Julian that I had placed on the wooden mantel. "Do you think Daddy is happy that we are here now instead of that big scary house?" she asked with a curious and peaceful expression on her face. I pulled her into my arms and told her that her father would be incredibly proud of the brave young girl she had become throughout this difficult journey. We had reclaimed our dignity and our freedom through the truth, while the Millers were left to face the consequences of their own darkness alone in the desert. Before we close today's turbulent story, I want to make sure you don't overlook the small but vital details that Bethany experienced. From my perspective, silence in the face of evil is sometimes even more terrifying than the act of cruelty itself. Bethany's in-laws didn't just mistreat a child, they weaponized the concept of family to trample on another person's dignity. The biggest lesson here is that our kindness must have boundaries, and thorough legal preparation is the most powerful weapon to protect our loved ones. I believe Bethany's decision to cut ties completely was the bravest and most practical choice. But what about you? If you were humiliated during a Christmas party like that, would you be calm enough to gather evidence, or would you react purely on emotion? Is there a more humane way to resolve this while still ensuring justice? Leave your thoughts or personal experiences in the comments below. I look forward to discussing them with you all. Once again, I sincerely thank all of you for taking your precious time to listen to this story from beginning to end. Your support and civilized comments are the driving force for me to continue creating more valuable content. If you found this story meaningful, please share it to spread the message of independence and self-respect. I will see you all in the next dramatic stories.